Jwalin, you may begin now.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. It is lovely to see some of you from the camera. Um, I'm hoping that I'm audible. Can everyone hear me? Jing, are you able to hear
Yes,
me?
yes, yes,
Okay,
we can hear you.
perfect. Um, Thank you once again for inviting me to this session. Today, I'm going to talk about education for harmony and eco-peace. Largely, I've been questioning the purpose of education and what do we want to really prepare our children for. And it was a real pleasure to see this invite on rethinking education, education for environmental education, education for eco-peace. So I'm going to use this opportunity where I present a few core ideas over the next 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have maybe 10-15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Um, as I begin, the context is set by a book which is called Learning to Live Together Harmoniously, Spiritual Perspectives from Indian Classrooms, along with a couple of publications on Ecopeace, Nature as an Educator, and a whole series of interventions that I've been running at a grassroots level organization in Western India over the past 12 years. Um, with that said, to open up today's discussion, I would want all of us to reflect on what kind of education do we need in today's day and world. I frequently heard notions of we need education for academic excellence, for helping children prosper in the world, for getting jobs. But I think we live in a very rapidly changing world, and there are a whole set of issues that we haven't really thought about. Um, we do speak about these, but I think our education system is geared for something very different. So, in the context of climate crisis, fragmentation, polarization, displacement, consumerism, or anthropocentrism, I think we need to critically reevaluate what do we need education for, or what type of education is valuable in today's day and age. Many of these issues that I'm talking about are deeply interconnected, and it all stems from a very different philosophical or epistemological perspective. Epistemology is basically how we get to learn things, how do we see the world around us. So these ontological, epistemological frameworks is where I think we have ended up in a crisis of a philosophical crisis. Um, and I think the crisis is largely that the modernist education system is deeply fragmented and it's deeply anthropocentric, that is, human centric. And this leads to ideas of reductionism, instrumentalism, materialism, and self centrism. So when I say anthropocentric, everything in our system is thought about with the human in the center. How can we use the nature for our own benefit? How can we take benefit of each other for our own survival? At any whenever I have opened textbooks, it's always from the point of view of a human being. So that's the whole idea of an anthropocentric education system where it becomes very fragmented. We start dividing things. We divide disciplines, subjects, grades. You'll have students in different grades. It becomes a very factory-like model. I'm sure many of you might have heard about the jail analogy or a factory analogy of the current education system, where the system deeply reduces people and fragments them and groups them into batches or into disciplines. And we lose the holistic perspective that the real world is about. Because in the real world, let's say there is a tsunami coming, the math is not different from the science, and that is not different from the social science of it. It's a lived phenomenon. Like the scorching heat in India this summer, it has all aspects. It has geography, it has sciences, it has social sciences of how do people cope with this. So the modern education system was born largely in the era of industrial revolution, and it was largely meant as a way of building compliance, transferring knowledge, the idea of a banking model of education. There is an expert out there who knows everything, and that knowledge needs to be transferred to students. But in reality, we live in a very interconnected world. Um, some people refer to this idea of an interbeing where all of us are deeply interconnected. And I think this is the profound crisis of consciousness that we deal with, and that is at the heart of a lot of crises, be it of climate, be it of justice, be it of democracy. And in order to tackle these crises, we really need to reevaluate some of our foundational precepts or concepts about what is education for. So today's talk is largely divided into three sections. I will continue talking about the philosophy of education for harmony for the next 5-10 minutes. Thereafter, I want to delve into pedagogical practices. What can we really do? What can an alternative education really look like in classrooms? Following that, I want to talk about a series of educational interventions we have tried that try and change the mainstream education system. So, three parts for today, and end with a series of critical questions that I might open the floor to, that you might have. I have a few questions as well. So, let's start with the philosophy. Let's stay on to this idea of there is a crisis of consciousness that affects both how our education system operates, and the education system feeds into this crisis of consciousness. Um, so there has long been a call for a very different kind of education. We have had philosophers like Dalai Lama, Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, Aurobindo. These are Indian or Tibetan scholars. But even beyond India, you have had educationists like Freire, Dewey, who have called for a very different kind of education. An education where we really talk about development of the whole child. And it goes beyond academic to aspects of the spiritual in the child or the heart of the child. Um, as we think about this, over the last 8 years, I've been trying to really unpack what could a different vision for education be. I'm presenting a data poem. This poem comes from educators in India, educators in very alternative schools that have been questioning and rethinking the purpose of education. And it's a data poem. So it's largely their phrases and their words that I am presenting. But here it goes. Um, 12 plus 4, long years at school that we want to put everyone through. Why do we even care? What is the purpose? A child doesn't know anything, and a school or a college will educate him or her to make money, prepare him for the future, to make an economic contribution, to create good citizens. But really, is education just that? An instrument for future success? Do we even know what the future would be like? Did we know about the pandemic, the financial crisis, Brexit, or these never ending wars? In an ever changing world, perhaps change is the only constant. And what about the inherent value of education? The intrinsic value of the process of learning, the value of developing multifaceted perspectives, the value in appreciating beauty around us, and the value in understanding one's own self. Perhaps then, an education that frees one, opens the head, heart, and hands, helps develop appreciation rather than just an acceptance of diversity. An education that helps find beauty in understanding others rather than just tolerating others. can inculcate values of unity, kindness, empathy, gratitude, and compassion, which might just make these 12 long years at school valuable. So, as I say that poem, for me, there are different things that stand out. And if I was there in person, I would want to hear a bit of your opinions and thoughts as well. But I'll reserve that for the end Q&A. Today, I would want to take us a step further, saying, you rethink the value of these 12 years of education that we put all children through, what kind of education system do we need? Are we happy with the education system that we currently have, that every child goes through? It's very centralized. It's similar for every child. It serves a purpose of, can we assess children at the end of it, rather than allowing children to prosper or flourish in their own aspirations, in their own strengths, in their own interests. And I think we make children deeply individual and we treat them as individuals, and lose the collective, we lose the sense of connection with, I think, others and the world for sure, but even one's own self. So my work in Education for Harmony has led to development of a conceptual framework. This framework is where I advocate that we need a different education that leads to discovery of one's own self. Who am I? What are my interests? Where am I? What are my own emotions? What is my own grounding? Helps discovery of others and leads to discovery of the world across 6 dimensions. Dimensions of awareness, caring relations, sense of purpose as a will to act, because without that no one's doing anything. Unless I'm moved by climate crisis around me, I will not do anything. A change in perspective, where we start thinking of the world as deeply interconnected and interdependent, and very impermanent, very transient. It changes rapidly, which might then lead to compassionate action, where we can take action about things that affect us. And finally, all these 5 dimensions can feed into the sense of wisdom. Now, these dimensions or domains are not fragmented, they're deeply interconnected. So, if you do one, I think you end up doing all of them. So, if you start with, let's say, any one of these, let's say we get students to volunteer and they start doing community service, that will lead to sensitivity to others, which will in turn lead to a mutual sense of respect, which can lead to a bit more self transformation. Okay, I see others are struggling with XYZ. Now I can change my own behaviors as well. It also leads to this sense of empathy and kinship, that everyone is much like me. All of us want very similar things in life. And this in turn leads to this idea of, it's an interconnected, interdependent world. With very small things that I do here, it affects people all across India, or all across the world, or all across South Korea. And which then feeds back into this notion of seva or community responsibility. So this is a education for harmony framework, but at the heart of it is this philosophical crisis, a crisis of consciousness, where currently we see everything around us as something that can serve humans or something that can serve the individual. And instead, an harmony-based perspective would really talk about, can we live together? Can we work with each other? Can we live in coexistence and in peace with the environment and with others around us? This also influences our pedagogical approaches, because pedagogically, currently we use silos, we use academic education split into subjects, whereas an eco-peace based approach would be deeply experiential, embodied. I have been reading that the education ministry in South Korea and Incheon is planning river walks, is planning deep immersive experiences for children. Um, which is a very different way of looking at education. There's a second interconnected problem where current education system is very egocentric. It has each individual at the center, and we are taught I am separate from you and we are separate from each other. Every country is different. Humans are separate from animals. It doesn't end this fragmentation, because then you can start fragmenting people by gender, by race, by country, by religion. You can by class, by profession. There's no end to this fragmentation. Whereas an ecocentric perspective or an interbeing centric perspective would talk about all of us are connected. There's no fragmentation. So it's coming from a different level of consciousness, that as people across the world, we are very similar in certain ways and different in our own ways, but deeply connected. So keep these philosophical precepts in mind, and we can touch upon how would these philosophical precepts then be applied to nature education or environmental education or eco-peace based education. Currently, across a lot of countries, we have environmental education programs where we just talk about saving the planet Earth. And children in India at least take that away, saying we need to do XYZ to save the planet Earth. But the planet has been here forever and it will be here forever for a much longer time. I think we are really talking about saving the human in the planet, creating conditions where human beings can survive. Because with our current consumeristic or anthropocentric ways of living, I don't think humanity survives more than a couple of decades or centuries. And we're not trying to save the planet. Instead, we are trying to save us, and that's where we need to transition. Can we transition from talking about saving the nature, saving the planet, to building relations of care with nature, realizing that we live in nature, we are not separate, we are not apart from nature, but we are rather a part of nature. So we're not separate from nature, but live with nature. Even if we might live in four walls, even if we might live in glass buildings, we are still a part of nature and we are not separate from it, despite all false realities that we might create for ourselves. So we really need to start thinking about within education systems, can we start reframing the role of nature from being treated as a resource to talking about building a connection with the world, with the nature, with the ecosystem around us. I'm going to pause here with the philosophy. We have spent roughly 20 minutes on the philosophy, and I want to go into more interesting bits, which are around pedagogical practices. I do have a data poem. I will skip through this. I'll talk about a couple of highlighted points um, that are our education system that really liberates or frees one from one's own self and social stereotypes would really become far more meaningful. I would want an education that shapes children into gazelles, lions, peacocks, someone that is fundamentally different from mice preparing for rat races. Perhaps I would want an education that embodies freedom, love, equity, compassion, harmony, and creates a very different way of life, a humane way of living and being. And this is only possible through shared lived experiences with trees, birds, animals, and humans. And only through these shared ways of living and being, through shared introspections, reflections, meditations, can we find the balance and holism of the yin and yang coefficients. In order to bring such an education about, I think there are 6 critical pieces to it. These are content. We can obviously have content that engages students in some of these aspects. Over the years, we have tried some of these. A lot of my classes have frequently been in nature, in outdoor spaces, but talking about nature. However, there are limitations. There are a lot of SEL curricula around the world that talk about socio-emotional learning, but then it still replicates this egocentric, anthropocentric way of living and being. What I've frequently seen, and this is quoting a nature educator in India, and he was saying that when we think about or when we teach about nature, we talk about how XYZ plant or XYZ mountain is useful, rather than talking about who is it useful for? Why are we talking about using nature to serve us? So, when in environmental education we talk about preserving nature, preserving the environment, it is frequently on carbon footprints. Can forest act as a carbon sink? Can oceans act as a carbon sink? And it still has us as human beings at the heart of it. Instead of really thinking about nature is in has its own life and can we respect nature for nature itself. The second aspect that we could use to bring about such an education for harmony is around pedagogical approaches, pedagogies, and how we manage children's behaviors. So, pedagogically, a lot of my research has been in very alternative schools in India, and all of them are deeply immersive, deeply collaborative. Many of them get rid of subject divides. They have 3 hour long projects, and these projects go on for 2 months and they cover all disciplines through it. A lot of these projects involve social service as a key component of these projects. They involve deep immersion, where children go out, collect data, survey people. They might be 10-year-olds, doesn't matter. They might be an 8-year-old, doesn't matter. But it's all in the real world. And then classrooms become spaces of reflection, developing ideas, dialogue. And assessment is very different then because it's a very different pedagogical approach, which also feeds into assessment. And then the assessment is self directed, peer directed, where children come together and say, this year, this is what I want to learn for myself or what I want to grow in. And at the heart of it is really the teacher, the educator's relation with the child, and the educator's ways of living for themselves, and an educator's vision for education, the philosophy of education. So a lot of these teachers and educators themselves have been questioning purposes of education. They themselves would be a part of various different eco activities, various different social service activities. They're constantly trying to change their own way of life. And they don't necessarily see themselves as knowledge holders, but they see themselves as facilitators of discussion of how they can live a different life for themselves along with the children. So for me, education, we need a different kind of education that leads to a different way of living and being. It's really a children spend 6, 8 hours, they're spending up 1/3 of their lives at school. So it's really a way of living. And if we foster competition, then competition becomes the way of living. And children start competing on how I can do better than another student, as opposed to thinking of all of us at the end of the day live on an island, be it a planet. Planet Earth is still an island in the larger cosmos or the universe. And on this island, we are in the same boat per se. We face the same struggles, and there are many very large crises that we face. Then, what is the way of living and being that I need to adopt? Rather than do we compete with each other? So, we need a culture or an ethos of holistic education for harmony that shapes our ways of living and being. Krishnamurti is an educationist from India, a spiritual leader as well. And he has frequently spoken about how we are losing touch with nature and how this loss of touch with nature also then feeds into our relations with other human beings, where we lose the ability to connect and we start treating each other also as resources that can be exploited. And all of us become too occupied with our own private ideas, thoughts, pleasures, and pains. Finally, a major piece that Carlotta, one of my co-authors, and I have spoken about is we don't need to learn about nature. Yes, there is value in learning about nature, in biomimicry, but we should learn with, within, and from nature. Can we live with and within nature? Or can we learn, be inspired from nature? And there is a lot one can do. So as you think about the Ecopeace modules that you would want to run or you would want to implement as a policy, I would want us to think about, can it teach concepts of freedom, of cycles of change, about impermanence, about circularity, about diversity-based oneness, about interconnection? Can children learn skills of observation, responsibility taking, self-regulation, teamwork, problem solving, just by being in nature? Let them play around, let them sit, let them sketch, let them draw, let them be who they are. But through being, they will learn concepts, skills, and different ways of living and being, where they start absorbing things through embodied ways of living, through multisensorial learning, where their natural curiosity is promoted. They learn to slow down, they learn to live in harmony. And I think that nature has capacity to be one of the best teachers or an educator. And as teachers or educators ourselves, we can also take a back step and let children learn from nature, with nature, and within nature. And finally, now maybe in the last in another 10 minutes, I want to talk about what is the role, what are things we have tried within mainstream education systems. Till now, I've spoken about very alternative schools. These are schools that are far and few between. Um, they cater to smaller numbers of students, whereas we have millions of students in India, and we've been thinking about how can we change or how can we bring this kind of education to all. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I will do a quick run through some of our interventions. We are very happy to share. We are very happy to share curricula, pedagogical practices, lesson plans to run communities of practice for any educators that are interested. Um, and a lot of our work at Tide Foundation focuses on self-transformation and social transformation. That creates a nexus of education for harmony. Over the years, we believe that each child is surrounded by the school, which is surrounded by the community, surrounded by the city and the planet. But all of these are spheres that are deeply interconnected and influence each other. So no child is independent of their school or their home. No child is independent of their community or their city, neither independent of the planet. A lot of these consumeristic trends come on advertisements on television that feed right back into the child. Um, and at Tide, we talk about a cares dimensions where we're talking about consciousness, attunement and empathy, reflection and imagination, engagement and empowerment, and the sense of social and civic responsibility. So over the years, we have developed frameworks that really get children to engage in these dimensions and transform themselves and their image in societies or communities. It, it is integrated into these kind of outcomes of self-development, self-transformation, cognitive ability, and socio-emotional learning. These are pillars. I'm happy to share the slides post the presentation, but I would keenly want to talk about what have we done so far. So we have series of intervention that go to different depths, and these vary across children that are just doing exploring exploratory work as a geo-inquiry project, or it goes into building dialogue, it goes further into leading to real change, and finally into leading community-wide change. I will talk through each of these in a bit, in a very short, succinct manner. So our workshops are very low stake, can be done with young students, older students, that allow children to step or dip their feet into the ocean of climate change, social change, self-transformation. These include very short workshops, 3 to 4 hour long, but also geo-inquiry projects. Such projects are really about, can you take a walk along the river and just inquire what are the problems there? Can you take a walk in a community and understand what are the ecological problems you face, that community faces? And then there is also another model that does a bit of this, but promotes a bit more dialogue and planning for older students. This is more about, much like an MUN, Model United Nations, we run model city councils, where children across schools and universities come together to talk about their own city and really think about what are we to do if we were to reimagine our city? What are the challenges, critical challenges in my city? Can I go out again, do these mini geo inquiry projects, talk to people, understand problems, and then come up with potential solutions that can be implemented by children or adolescents and youth in the room or by the city government? We also take it a step further where we ask students, okay, you can talk about these ideas, that's well and good, but can you really act on it? Can you really make a difference? And then we do these 2 day camps or these mini model city councils. And then children are expected to use the next 3, 4 months implementing ideas that they've developed, or to mobilize other students around them. So let's say we have had a model city council which has had 3, 4 representatives from 30 schools. They then go back and talk about, let me mobilize the rest of my children or rest of the students in my classroom, in my school, to really make a difference. Um, and finally, we have a much deeper social change maker fellowship. This is a 8 month long fellowship. We work with 8 to 10 students, really try and figure out how can they change the world around them. So this is an example where one student decided to clean up a lake, and he, over the 8 month period, looked at what were the causes of the problem. He went around, spoke to various villagers around, and he figured out, okay, there's a lot of fertilizer runoff. There is how the lake water is being used. It has become very stagnant. It hasn't been cleaned or desilted for a long time. Frequently, trash gets mixed in it. Sewage might also feed into it. And he then started looking at global solutions around the world. He found a company in India that asked a very large amount of money, around $5,000, to clean up the lake. And then he said, okay, no, I will do it myself. And he ended up cleaning the lake in $50. And what he did was he made these floating islands that had native plants. And he put these floating islands that you can see on your screens in this lake. He did a pilot first in his own backyard, took water from that lake, put these floating islands, tested the water, checked if it made a difference, and then installed numerous of these. He mobilized his whole society, the building society, housing society he lived in, to make these floating islands and then to install these floating islands in these lake. And it cleaned up the lake to the extent that biological oxygen demand or chemical oxygen demand and the dissolved nitrates were halved, nearly halved. The dissolved phosphates were down to 1/3. down by 1/3, and the oxygen levels went up threefolds. It went up 200%. So these were some changes that he saw in the water quality, and this is at the very far extreme where a child has taken 8 months and mobilized 100 people to clean up a lake and done deep analysis, understood the root causes of it, figured out a way to solve it. Although this is still temporary because the root causes, be it around fertilizer runoff, haven't been solved. Um, but this student that you see on the screen was an 11th grader, that is a 16, 17-year-old. Right now he's at Johns Hopkins University and he's pursuing biosciences there. But this is what he had taken up 2 years back. So we have had a history of this where students take up social action projects, but the focus is still self-transformation. Can you change how you live? And what does that self-transformation really look like? And for us, it has been this process of creating that space for children to really see the interconnections, to problem solve, to really figure out what can they do. And it's within this space that they foster or they thrive. And it isn't really about following a set curriculum of let's do X, Y, Z, but it's about creating that space for children to really understand themselves, to sit with problems, to understand the society, to work with their friends and peers to solve problems. So these are some things that we have tried at Tide Foundation. There is a series of basic pedagogical principles that underpin it. Um, but moving ahead into my concluding slides, for the next 5, 7 minutes, I would want us to reflect on a couple of things, saying, how do you imagine educational systems changing for South Korean context? Do you see these as happening through small steps, or do you see the need for a system-wide overhaul, where, for example, a step-by-step pathway could be we introduce a new subject, slowly we talk about these pedagogical approaches, and we talk about how ideas of ecopeace can be integrated into every subject, be it math, science, languages. And then we talk about, can we redo our assessment, and how do you even assess connection with nature? Very difficult to do. And then we talk about changing classroom ethos. Or do you think there is a need for a complete overhaul where you say, no, no, the current system comes from a different philosophical point of view. We need a radically different philosophical approach. In my opinion, I think you need a bit of both as a middle path. It's not either or. I think these have to coexist, where a philosophical overhaul happens within teachers' own ways of thinking, whereas a step-by-step transformation happens within systems. But that is my take. As we will open for questions after 5 minutes, I would love to hear from some of you in terms of how do you embody these ideas of eco-peace within South Korean education systems, and what is your perspective? So please hold on to this question. And to quickly summarize what I've covered today, we started with this philosophy of education, and we went into pedagogical practices in alternative schools. And finally, we spoke about some interventions that work within mainstream schools. So within these three sections, we have covered ideas of what can eco-peace really look like? How can it be implemented in practice within alternative spaces? And how can it be implemented within mainstream spaces?